Before starting this post, even if it's a story that happened years ago, I just want to make it clear that every name included in this post was changed to make sure to protect the kid's privacy. You see, ever since I met this kid, he's always intrigued me. But no matter how hard I try to ignore the little strange things surrounding him, I can't seem to brush off that awful feeling which shakes my composure. A feeling that creeps on me every time I look at him from afar, from where he can't see me. I was 36, and he was no more than 7. I should be responsible. I was his teacher, be able to rationalize everything and keep my head cool no matter the circumstances. Yet, it's getting harder and harder to act like nothing is wrong with how his brain is working. I'm not trying to inculpate him. I actually fear what his behavior might do to me in the following years, hence why I'm writing this. You see, this particular student, whom I'm calling Basile, for clarity's sake, has always acted a bit out of it, as my colleagues and some of my friends put it. He's a kid that's always loved smiling, for no particular reason. He just loves doing it. However, I started to sense that something was wrong with him when he wouldn't stop, even after getting hurt or messing up in class. I can guarantee that Basile might be the clumsiest student I've ever had. What generally unnerves me the most about Basile, however, is his prolonged periods of complete blackout. He has a tendency to completely shut his brain off to the rest of the world and simply watch in silence the emptiness around him, only coming back with a laugh and teary eyes when someone urges him to respond. It's like he lives in his own little world most of the time. Sadly, it's a major deterrent in his social life. Given that he mostly dozes off or shuts his brain down during class, he's a subject of mockery that can resemble bullying a bit too much for my taste. I try my best to mitigate this negative attention he seems to always get, but that doesn't stop him from slowly becoming a pariah during breaks. To be fair, Basile does have something close to a friend. Well, at least he seems to like him, even if that feeling isn't mutual. It's a kid that I'll call Quentin, and what you should remember about him is that he unfortunately got caught in a car crash with his family. All survived with more or less minor injuries, except for Quentin, who lost the usage of his legs. He was inconsolable for weeks, mostly because he couldn't partake in his favorite sport anymore. That's when Basile started to become extremely interested in him, and when I truly started to see just how deep the rabbit hole surrounded this kid goes. Quentin, after finally gathering the courage to go back to school for the first time in months, was immediately jumped by Basile. Obviously, a lot of them were curious or saddened by his state. Basile, however, really was the only one to be excited about it. He didn't seem to have any ill will towards his now disabled comrade, yet the whole class was off-put by his earnest attempts to cheer Quentin up, often resulting in some fighting and crying on Quentin's side. Strangely, his protests never deterred Basile, who simply continued this thing without bearing any hard feelings or getting angry at the other kids. He became way more active, but was still trapped inside his bubble. He could still spend minutes, maybe hours, just staring into space, especially in class. In the end, I think it worked out, though. After days of trying to make Basile stop bothering Quentin, the latter came to me and simply asked to let him be. Even if I don't know why he's changed so much, he's the only one at school that treats me like a person. Doesn't make everything a pity party. He's kinda nice, even if he's weird, so I don't mind his presence. It didn't feel satisfying at all. Didn't feel right at all. Nonetheless, since both parties seemed content with the situation, I couldn't get involved in all of this. At least, I shouldn't have. But Basile's behavior seemed stranger and stranger to me. He was starting to speak of seeing Quentin walking in an empty space. He drew disturbing imagery, sometimes simply coloring the page with one color, before speaking of the many wonders inside the color. I couldn't bear it anymore. I needed to find its root. I wondered many times before going through with this if I was going insane. Still, my curiosity and my fear won over my rationality, so I asked Basile to stay in class. He didn't seem to really mind or question why I asked him. Thankfully, he actually came instead of forgetting about the appointment, as he tended to do for anything related with administration. However, his clumsiness or lack of attention led to him hitting a wall and getting the door to his face while trying to walk up to my office. I also noted his lack of focus when I tried to reassure him that he didn't look too bad. He seemed entirely comfortable with how he acted these past few weeks. No regret or self-doubt. This led me to audibly sigh. Basile didn't seem to catch my exasperation. His expression remained unwavering. A small smile, empty eyes, and it was as if he was frozen like a statue. Knowing I wouldn't go far by trying to find a roundabout way to get him to explain his change in attitude, I opted for a more straightforward approach. Basile, I need you to be honest with me. What is it, Teach? The sentence actually piquing his curiosity. I spoke again, hoping my tone wouldn't betray any kind of nervousness. What's going on with Quentin? Why did you suddenly feel the need to be nice towards him? His apathy was replaced by something I couldn't read at the time. He looked extremely embarrassed, but also guilty. And still, he let out a laugh. It didn't sound childish despite his age. It sounded desperate. I can make things right, if I can take care of Quentin. He was starting to shake as his voice became weaker and weaker. However, this sudden show of weakness was quickly replaced by a sudden jump onto my desk. Teach, can I ask you a question? I backed off a bit before actually answering. Sure, but stay in your chair, please. He made a small, apologetic sound before resuming his talking. If something disappears, it's -1, right? I had no idea where he was going with this. Yeah? Ignoring my confusion, he continued. But if something is given in return, it's +1, right? I nodded in response. He was beaming with misplaced pride. He probably misunderstood my confusion or thought getting his teacher confused made him smarter. Well, if -1 meets +1, then they cancel each other out, so nothing has happened in the end. I couldn't bear seeing the conversation get more and more astray, so I asked, Basile, where are you going with this? Then it hit me. Is this about Quentin's lost legs and how you're trying to be an uplifting influence on him? Is that it? I appreciate you trying so hard to brighten his day, but I wasn't sure what to say next, or if him comparing this ordeal to a mathematical operation was a good sign or not. But in the end, I took it as just a little boy being concerned for a classmate's well-being. However, he looked at me strangely. No, the -1 is me. The +1 is Quentin's bad day. I was dead wrong. His cold answer, one that seemed so logical in his mind, frightened me. This was the first time in my career I felt any kind of fear towards one of my pupils. I struggled to get out another word, but I needed to know more. What do you mean by that? He smiled brightly, innocently. Well, I'm a bad kid, so this accident gives me a chance to be better. Flabbergasted, outraged, speechless. These words wouldn't even be enough to describe how I was feeling at that moment. Several thoughts plagued my mind. What kind of 7-year-old thinks and acts this way? How can he say things like that with such a carefree attitude? What about that moment of weakness? Did I imagine it? I tried to pry a bit more, but he wouldn't speak about it. His brain had shut down when I asked about why he thought of himself this way. He left my office without listening to me, that unnerving boy disappearing from my view, although his little cries in the corridor didn't escape my ears. I had the urge to join him in the corridor and comfort him, especially if he actually was putting up a front when talking about his self-esteem issues. Yet I stopped myself. I rationalized that me suddenly showing up wouldn't help him open up to me. But as he left, I I heard his footsteps coming to a sudden halt. A weak "Dad" was all I could fully understand before the footsteps came back in my direction. Basil was standing in my doorway, his eyes darker than anything I'd ever seen. He wasn't saying anything, just looking at me at what felt like an eternity. I tried to say something, but the words just died in my throat. He opened his mouth to answer my almost question. "If only I could trade your life for his, you invading prick." But it was deep, too deep. His voice couldn't belong to a child. Still, Basil was the only thing in front of me. He had to have said it. I was petrified. He left without saying another word. The suffocating silence of the classroom was all that reminded me of the fact that I was alive. After minutes, maybe hours, I continued my usual routine as if nothing had happened. I locked the classroom, went to my car, and drove myself home as I sat on my rundown sofa. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except I had no recollection of ever doing that. It was as if my mind had been completely shut down. I simply awoke in the middle of the night, briefly wondering how I even got back to my flat before going back to sleep. Well, sleep is a generous word to describe what happened that night. Nightmares kept me company, and I had to call off the next day due to my unbelievable tiredness. Eventually, I calmed down and went back to my job, but I became wary of Basil. I found myself staring at him more and more, hoping to prevent him from catching me by surprise. However, my behavior ended up being a frequent subject of questions and discussions among the students. Not wanting the situation to get out of control, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to stop being worried about one of my students, especially if my behavior could end up damaging said student's reputation. I was a professional. I couldn't let my bias overtake my duties. I was scared. It pains me to admit it now, but I found myself terrified of Basil. Being scared of a grade schooler. How pathetic. That's why it took me a month to properly gather up the courage to ask for a meeting with his family. In the meantime, the rumors had begun to run rampant, and some people tried to bully Basil. I felt ashamed. It was exactly what I had predicted, yet I could not act to defend this child. Luckily, Quentin had stepped in, even amongst his former friends. I wasn't sure if their friendship was healthy, but I was glad he was around, no matter how uncomfortable I got while watching them play. Sometimes, Basil would show Quentin people or events that didn't seem to exist or happen. He could also hurt him by saying that he could see him running freely somewhere, or abruptly stop his movements to cry out at something. As for Quentin, sometimes he would brawl with Basil, or a bully, but most of the time, he would push Basil out of harm's way. It was strange how poor his luck seemed to be. Nonetheless, they were happy like this. I didn't know what to think. Still, I needed to meet his family. So, I stopped finding excuses. That's why 2 weeks later, I found myself at the doorstep of a small but seemingly cozy house. I was greeted by a middle-aged lady, looking slightly older than I was. She invited me in, but I found no sign of Basil, only pictures of him with a man I didn't recognize. When I asked her about her son, her face illuminated with motherly joy. "Oh, my little angel isn't here right now. He's currently playing with his new friend." I tried to get her to clarify what she meant. "Are you talking about Quentin?" She clapped her hands together. "Yes, that's his name. He's one of your students, I assume. Poor thing." She didn't add anything else, but she didn't have to. She knew about the accident. That meant I could safely bring out the topic of Basil's behavior more easily. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, Quentin's been the subject of something terrible." She cut me off before I could add anything else. "That's why I'm proud of my baby for deciding to become his friend. I was scared he would end up alone, but to hear that those two are getting along so well, it's truly a miracle." The heavy feeling in my chest came back. No point in beating around the bush. I needed to be more direct. "About that, miss, I think your son's not being a healthy support system for Quentin." Her cheerful behavior slowly faded away, being replaced by something I could only describe as saddened resignation. Her smile was still there, but much thinner, her eyes pleading me to stop talking. A faint, "Oh no," left her lips. I found it strange that his first friend was handicapped because of... I found myself insisting, pushing her to tell me why Basil is the way he is. Tears started to stroll down her face, so I reassured her. "Miss, I want to help both of these kids, but please, be honest with me. What happened to Basil? Why is he the way that he is?" Regardless of her tears, her eyes looked into mine. The sadness and fatalism were mixed together in a stare I would remember my entire life. "Basil heard his father die in a car crash while on the phone with him." Despite sitting in a chair, I felt my entire body grow heavier with each passing second. I couldn't move. Images were flashing inside my head. "Was it... I'm so sorry for your loss," I said to the woman, who was now barely holding her tears. My words were sincere, but they must have sounded so fake to someone who's still in grievance. Still, I continued to talk in hopes that I would learn more and diffuse the situation. "If I'm not being too indiscreet..." "You already were, you idiot," I told myself. "May I learn more about Basil, how he was prior to this, and how this affected him?" His mother silently nodded, eyes still red, and told me everything. "You see, my son has always been a secluded person with a view of the world that nobody could fully grasp. Among what you would describe, like seeing fictional persons or drawing moves on his own, are things he actually did before. Thankfully, his father did his best to connect with him, and it worked. Basil was always excited to show him his new creation or talk about his latest epiphany, but then the tragedy struck." A hiccup interrupted her tale, so I timidly tried to reassure her. "If it's too hard for you, don't feel obliged to continue." She shook her head. "No, I feel it's good to let everything out. Another oddity surrounding Basil is his poor luck. Whenever he tries to do something, most of the time it backfires. Some of the more superstitious members of the family even ended up thinking he was cursed. That's obviously not the case. It's ridiculous. But only my husband, his father, had the strength to protest, defend him, against them." Hearing this, a question came to me. Is that outlook on his luck one of the reasons he mostly prefers to keep to himself? She offered a weak, "I don't know," as a response before saying, "At least fictional characters can't hurt him." Another pause in the conversation happened, the air gradually becoming tenser and tenser. "He heard everything. When I asked him to phone his father, I never expected..." Her face gradually lost her color. That should have been my cue to stop prodding. But I didn't. I was foolish enough to continue. I've also seen Basil get lost in his mind, even with his new friend. He can cry or laugh about whatever he sees. Is there something other than fictional characters or famous people that he can think about? Has he ever talked to you about it? Wordlessly, his mother stood up and incited me to follow her up the stairs. A bit of a silent walk later, we arrived in the attic, where a little box stood out. It was well kept compared to the dusty furniture all around it. She opened it and took out a stack of papers. "He never explicitly told me, but I've seen his drawings," she said before handing them over. I felt like I was going to cry myself. Most had little notes in the left corner, explaining when or how he saw these visions. Most were crudely drawn, but strong with emotions. Some had Quentin happily walking. Some had Basil's father cuddling him or coming to school to take him home. But others were red or black, scribbled messes. Me when Dad got hurt. Dad going elsewhere. Quentin leaving. Me when Mom doesn't love me anymore. His imagination was completely corrupted by tragedy. No matter how hard he tried to forget it, his subconscious would catch up. His positive daydreams would turn to nightmares. He blamed himself for everything. I could now understand what he meant, despite how twisted his -1+1 explanation sounded. He was just a kid, trying to fix his mistake after being given another chance. Although with that said, one of his drawings intrigued me more than others. It was a poorly drawn representation of himself, being held by the throat by a black figure. He haunts me. I presented it to his mother. "Miss, what is that? What are you doing?" It was that voice again, the voice that shouldn't belong to a child. The two of us turned around instinctively to see Basil, knife in hand, an expression of pure rage on his face. His mother tried to calm him down. "Basil, snap out of it." However, instead, his eyes locked onto me, with a look of hatred so intense, he couldn't just describe it with words. He rushed at me and stabbed violently at my knee. The pain was unbelievable. Yells, blood, cries. That's all I saw before I fainted from shock. When I awoke, I was being taken by ambulance. The mother was frantically apologizing to me. I tried to reassure her, but when I saw Basil showing no remorse next to her, I couldn't bring myself to be gentler with her. My fears had come back, and his eyes haunted me to this day. What was he talking about in that drawing? Surely ghosts aren't real. However, what is it that possesses him during these violent outbursts? I think I'll never know for sure. After I recovered from my leg wound, at least as much as I could, the school administration made no concessions. Seeing that I was now forced to have a cane with me for the rest of my life, they promptly excluded Basil from school. Quentin tried to continue going to school, but the bullying and rumors were too tough even for him. He begged to be sent where Basil was. Apparently they reunited in some sort of youth re-education center. I had no idea if I should be opposed to this decision, but it didn't matter. Sadly, that's all there is to it. These conversations and drawings did give me the insight on how Basil saw the world. A lonely place that he might make friendlier, but I couldn't help him. His deep-rooted self-loathing, his general lack of focus, his obsession with Quentin. Speaking of which, neither of them showed up at the class reunion, which happened this year. According to one of their classmates, the soul who actually saw them after they went to rehab, it was better that way. Had Basil crossed a line? Had he rendered Quentin so dependent on him? Just like a lot of things in this post, I don't know. I couldn't even think or say anything when the student told me about it. So, here I am, now 48. 13 years have passed. Multiple children became my pupils, and I didn't encounter another Basil ever again. The doubts are eating me alive as I write this, for failing to offer any kind of solution, for letting this disturbing kid get away. Am I a failure as a teacher?
Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you haven't already, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. While you're here, maybe go ahead and give that video a like and drop a comment. I like it when people comment. If you're not too spooked and you think you might can handle a little more, why not go ahead and click on one of those other videos that's about to pop up. Maybe check out one of our playlists. There's quite a few. If you'd like to support the channel more monetarily, I'd suggest maybe you go pick up a copy of my latest book. There's a link below. Or maybe head on over to Patreon. I have quite a few tiers. I'm sure there's one that'll suit you best. Speaking of Patreon, let's go ahead and thank our patrons, shall we? Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Winters, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. Just couldn't do the show without you. If you're a fan of my books, I always recommend go ahead and join that Ghostly Reader tier. $10 a month, and it also gets you a book anytime I write one, which is around twice a year usually. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.